The mother's heart raced as she paced the living room, unable to shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Just hours ago, she had entrusted her newborn to the Hargrove Nursery, a place that seemed like a safe haven. But now, unease gnawed at her. The nursery had always been highly recommended, but the pit in her stomach told her otherwise. Her phone rang, the caller ID showing an unfamiliar number. She hesitated, then answered. A soft, trembling voice on the other end spoke urgently, telling her that the nursery was involved in something far darker than she could ever imagine. The voice was fearful, almost desperate, and the woman on the other end claimed to be an employee at the nursery. She had worked there for years, but she had just uncovered something horrifying. The woman spoke in hushed tones, explaining that the Hargrove sisters were running a secret operation, an illegal scheme involving newborns being swapped, stolen from unsuspecting parents. She said she had seen it firsthand, but feared for her life. Her only plea was that the mother find the truth before it was too late. Determined to uncover the truth, the mother's mind raced as she hung up the phone. She was already suspicious, but this phone call fueled her fear. Without wasting any more time, she decided to investigate the nursery herself. She had to see what was going on. The mother knew that the clock was ticking and her baby's safety could be in jeopardy. As she approached the nursery the following morning, her heart pounded in her chest, but she knew she couldn't walk away without answers. She needed to see the place for herself, to find something, anything, that could confirm what the employee had said. She slipped inside the nursery, pretending to be a new client, her eyes scanning every corner, every room, every detail. It seemed normal at first, but something felt off. The staff seemed distant, the babies quieter than they should have been. As she walked down the hallway, she noticed an office door slightly ajar. Without thinking, she pushed it open and stepped inside. The room was filled with files and paperwork, the smell of old paper filling the air. Her gaze fell on a large binder at the edge of a desk. It was labeled Adoptions, but as she flipped through the pages, her blood ran cold. Inside the binder, there were records of babies who had gone missing, along with photographs of families who were never informed. Some of the names matched the ones she had heard from the mysterious caller. But what caught her attention most was a document at the very back. It was signed by one of the Hargrove sisters and dated several years ago. The paper outlined a plan to swap babies between families, a practice that had been going on for years without parental consent. The revelation hit her like a ton of bricks. It wasn't just an isolated incident, it was a well-organized, secret operation. As the weight of the discovery sank in, the mother's mind raced. She realized she had stumbled upon a dangerous network, a child trafficking scheme that involved not only the Hargrove sisters, but also others who worked within the system to cover up the truth. The document she had found was proof that the nursery was not what it seemed. This wasn't just about one lost child. It was about a system that had been exploiting innocent families for years. The room felt colder now, as if the walls themselves were closing in on her. She had to act fast, but she also knew the dangers of crossing these people. The network was far more powerful than she could have ever imagined. The following day, the mother returned to the Hargrove nursery, now determined to uncover the truth, no matter the cost. With a sense of dread hanging over her, she approached the entrance with caution, knowing that the slightest mistake could blow her cover. She had to act normal, pretending to be just another anxious parent in search of a safe place for her baby. Her heart raced as she entered, and the smell of antiseptic and freshly cleaned floors greeted her, a stark contrast to the growing unease inside her. She was about to walk into a lion's den, and she knew it. The moment she was introduced to the Hargrove sisters, she immediately noticed something strange. Their smiles were too practiced, almost fake, as if they were reciting a script they had rehearsed for years. There was no warmth in their eyes, no genuine affection for the babies under their care. In fact, as the sisters led her through the nursery, they barely interacted with the children. Their attention was always elsewhere, as if the babies were nothing more than items on a checklist. The mother could sense something deeply unsettling in the way they spoke about the children, like they were just products to be dealt with, not human beings with lives and stories of their own. As they moved through the facility, the mother couldn't help but feel the weight of the oppressive atmosphere. The nursery was unusually quiet, no sounds of children crying or laughing, just an eerie stillness that sent a shiver down her spine. The Hargrove sisters didn't seem to notice the unsettling silence, as if they were accustomed to it. She forced a smile and nodded along with their conversation, all the while her mind was reeling. The unsettling feeling grew stronger with every step she took, and she could no longer ignore the suspicion gnawing at her. At the end of the tour, one of the sisters, sensing her hesitation, mentioned an office where all the paperwork was kept. The mother hesitated, but curiosity overcame her fear. As they walked past a hallway, she caught sight of a locked door that was slightly ajar. She had to know what was behind it. She made a mental note of the room's location, waiting for the perfect moment to investigate. When the sisters turned their attention elsewhere, she seized the opportunity to slip away. Her heart pounded as she approached the door, which creaked slightly when she pushed it open. Inside, the air felt stale, and the dim lighting added to the eerie atmosphere. The room was small, filled with filing cabinets and old boxes stacked haphazardly in the corners. It looked like an office from another era, untouched by time. Her fingers trembled as she began to sift through the papers, searching for anything that could confirm her worst fears. She opened a drawer and pulled out a thick folder. Inside, she found what appeared to be files on missing children, babies who had been reported as lost, but the cases had gone cold. Her eyes widened as she flipped through the pages, each one containing names, birth dates, and photographs of the families who had never been notified about the fates of their children. The more she read, the more horrified she became. The files weren't just records of babies that had disappeared. They were detailed accounts of children who had been swapped and placed with different families, all under the guise of legal adoption procedures. The pages contained official-looking stamps and signatures, making it all seem legitimate, but there was nothing legitimate about it. The truth hit her like a freight train. This was not just a series of isolated mistakes. It was an operation. The Hargrove sisters were at the center of a well-organized child trafficking network, and she had just uncovered the damning evidence. As she sifted through the files, her thoughts raced. She could feel the walls closing in, and the weight of the danger she was in started to sink in. These were not ordinary people. The Hargrove sisters were capable of anything to protect their empire, and now she had something they would do anything to retrieve. The mother knew she couldn't leave the room with these files. If the sisters discovered she had seen them, it could be the end for her. She quickly stuffed the documents into her bag, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew she had to leave the nursery immediately, but there was no telling how long she had before they noticed she was missing. The escape was a blur. Her mind was fogged with terror as she slipped through the halls, her every step feeling like it could be her last. As she reached the front door, her fingers fumbled for the handle, her breath shallow with fear. She pushed open the door, stepping into the daylight with the weight of the evidence heavy on her shoulders. The cool air outside felt like a release, but the dread didn't fade. She had uncovered a terrible truth, but now the question was, what was she going to do with it? The stakes were higher than ever, and the Hargrove sisters wouldn't let this go unpunished. With the files in her possession, the mother realized that she had uncovered the tip of an iceberg. The operation she had stumbled upon wasn't just confined to the nursery. It was part of a much larger network that involved more people than she could have imagined. The danger had escalated, and her role in this story was far from over. She knew she couldn't take this on alone, but who could she trust? The police, the authorities, they were all part of the system that allowed this to happen. Her options were limited, and time was running out. The deeper she dug, the more dangerous it became, but one thing was certain: she couldn't turn back now. The Hargrove sisters had always been different, and it was clear from the very beginning. Growing up in an orphanage on the outskirts of a quiet town, They were treated as outcasts, never quite fitting in with the other children. The orphanage itself was a grim, suffocating place where love and affection were in short supply. The sisters, Margaret and Eleanor, learned early on that survival meant keeping to themselves. They formed a bond so tight that nothing could break it, relying on each other for the warmth and care they were denied by the system. It was a harsh environment, and the trauma of their early years left lasting scars that shaped everything they would become. As the sisters grew older, the feelings of abandonment and neglect only deepened. Eleanor, the older of the two, began to show signs of a growing bitterness. Margaret, on the other hand, kept her emotions buried beneath a veneer of cold indifference. Their lives in the orphanage were marked by rejection and cruelty, and this sense of worthlessness followed them well into their teenage years. In those years, Eleanor became obsessed with the idea of escaping, not just from the orphanage, but from the pain that haunted her. She believed that if she could take control, if she could create something of her own, she could finally prove her worth to the world. One evening, when Eleanor was just 16, an event occurred that would forever change the course of their lives. A wealthy couple arrived at the orphanage, looking to adopt a child. Eleanor overheard their conversation in the hallway, and what she heard struck her to the core. The couple, desperate for a child, made it clear that they were willing to do anything to get one. Eleanor, feeling an intense need to prove herself, began to formulate a plan. She convinced her younger sister, Margaret, that they could improve the lives of the children brought into their care. By swapping babies, giving one family the child they wanted, while sending another child to a new home, they could finally take control of their destinies. At first, Margaret was horrified by the idea, but Eleanor's persuasive words and promises of a better life for them both were hard to ignore. The idea of changing their own fates by playing God with the lives of others took root in their minds. They began experimenting with the process, selecting children who could be swapped without anyone noticing. They justified it to themselves by telling themselves they were giving the children a better life, one filled with wealth and opportunity. In their twisted minds, they believed they were doing a service, creating new families and giving these children lives beyond their wildest dreams. Over the years, this twisted idea grew into something far more sinister. The nursery was born out of their need to perpetuate the scheme they had started all those years ago. The Hargrove sisters quickly realized they could make a significant profit from their secret operation. What began as a misguided attempt to escape the trauma of their past became a full-fledged criminal enterprise. They began to supply babies to wealthy families who couldn't conceive, convincing themselves that they were merely matching children to the parents who deserved them. The more they delved into the world of baby trafficking, the more their moral compass deteriorated, until they no longer saw the children as human beings, but as commodities. The deeper the sisters became involved in the nursery, the more they distanced themselves from the guilt they should have felt. Their twisted rationalizations, built upon the horrors of their upbringing, allowed them to justify their actions to themselves. Margaret became increasingly desensitized to the children's suffering, while Eleanor's obsession with control and power over others grew stronger. They stopped seeing themselves as victims of an unjust system, and began viewing themselves as the architects of a new one where they held the power to determine the lives of others. It was no longer about giving children a better life. It was about the control they now wielded. As time went on, the sisters' actions became more methodical and cold-blooded. They manipulated records, created false identities for the children they trafficked, and bribed officials to cover their tracks. The nursery, once a place meant to provide care and security, became a machine of exploitation. With each baby that was swapped or sold, they grew bolder, more ruthless. Yet, deep down, the pain from their past never truly left them. The memories of rejection and abuse from the orphanage followed them, shaping their every decision. They used this pain to fuel their actions, turning their twisted desire for control into a dangerous obsession. The truth of the Hargrove sisters' past is a complicated one While their upbringing humanizes them, showing how their childhood trauma shaped their worldview, it doesn't justify the evil they would go on to commit. Their actions, driven by fear, desperation, and a warped sense of entitlement, led them down a path that destroyed countless lives. The audience is left to grapple with the complexity of the sisters' motivations, understanding that their past shaped them, but ultimately they chose to perpetuate a cycle of darkness and exploitation. Their story is one of lost humanity, where the pain of the past turned them into the very monsters they once feared. As the investigation unfolded, the mother realized that the Hargrove sisters were involved in something far darker than she had ever imagined. It wasn't just about baby swapping. They were selling newborns to desperate couples who couldn't have children of their own. The more she uncovered, the more she was convinced that the nursery wasn't a place of care. It was a front for a sophisticated black market adoption ring. The realization shook her to the core, but the thought of her own child, potentially caught up in this web of deceit, drove her to continue searching for answers. Her world felt like it was crumbling, but she couldn't stop now. Her baby had to be found. Late one night, as she continued to dig deeper, she stumbled upon a terrifying discovery. In her desperation, she had reached out to a contact, a parent who had once used the Hargrove nursery. This parent, too, had been part of a similar situation, but they had been too afraid to speak up. However, their story had one striking similarity to hers. Another baby, a perfect match to her own, had been placed in the home of a wealthy family. The mother's heart skipped a beat. Could this be a coincidence, or had her child been swapped with someone else's? It was too much to ignore. The mother, consumed by dread, knew she had to see this for herself. She carefully arranged a meeting with the family who had received the child, posing as a potential friend seeking to meet other parents in the area. Her hands trembled as she rang the doorbell, the weight of her mission pressing down on her. When the door opened, a well-dressed couple greeted her with polite smiles, unaware of the storm she was about to bring to their doorstep. The moment she entered their home, her eyes immediately found the baby. The child in their arms looked exactly like hers, same eyes, same dark hair, same tiny hands. The resemblance was undeniable. A surge of panic hit her, but she kept her composure. She needed answers, and this was her only chance. She asked to hold the baby, her heart racing as she gazed down at the child in her arms. The mother of the wealthy family smiled, unaware of the turmoil in the other woman's heart. She couldn't bring herself to tell them the truth. Not yet. Instead, she quietly examined the baby, every feature, every detail. As she held the child, her mind was racing. The baby's soft breaths filled the air, and for a brief moment, she felt a flicker of hope. Maybe this was just a mistake, a misunderstanding, but deep down, she knew the truth. Her own baby had been taken. The confrontation with the Hargrove sisters was inevitable. Armed with the knowledge she had gathered, the mother returned to the nursery. Her heart pounded with a mixture of fear and fury. This time she didn't care about playing nice. She demanded to speak with the sisters, and the moment they appeared, she didn't hold back. The words poured out, the years of worry and confusion spilling into the air. She accused them of swapping babies, of tearing families apart for profit. The sisters' expressions remained unreadable, but the silence between them was heavy. For a moment, the mother feared she wouldn't get a response at all. But then, Eleanor, the older sister, spoke, her voice calm but laced with something darker. Eleanor admitted with a chilling sense of finality that the baby swapping was no mistake. It wasn't an accident or a series of unfortunate events. It was a deliberate, systematic practice that had been ongoing for years. The Hargrove sisters had orchestrated a network of adoptions under false pretenses, taking babies from families and selling them to those with the money and means to buy them. What had once begun as a misguided attempt to control their own destinies had spiraled into something far worse. Eleanor's cold, detached demeanor revealed how far gone she was, how numb she had become to the horror of what they were doing. The mother's blood ran cold as the truth settled in. She had known deep down that the sisters were involved in something sinister, but hearing it from their own lips was a gut-wrenching confirmation. Eleanor spoke about the scheme with a strange sense of pride, as if it were just another business venture to them. There was no remorse, no regret, just a calculated explanation of how they had managed to fool so many people for so long. The mother could barely contain her rage. She had come to this place to find her child, but instead she had uncovered a nightmare. The stakes were higher than ever, and now she had to decide, could she bring these people to justice, or would they silence her like they had silenced so many others? As the confrontation reached its peak, the mother realized the full extent of the danger she was in. The Hargrove sisters had ties to powerful people who would stop at nothing to protect their operation. The room felt colder now, the air thick with tension. Eleanor's eyes were cold and calculating, and the younger sister, Margaret, stood behind her, her face pale but resolute. It was clear that the sisters were not afraid to do whatever it took to maintain control. The mother knew she was walking a thin line between justice and disaster, and she had to act fast. She couldn't back down now. The truth was out, and she wasn't leaving until the sisters paid for what they had done. As the mother's investigation deepened, she realized she couldn't fight this battle alone. The weight of the truth was too much to bear on her own, and the threats from the Hargrove sisters were growing more dangerous with each passing day. She began reaching out to other families who had experienced similar horrors. It wasn't long before she found a network of parents, all victims of the Hargrove sisters' criminal operation. These families, once silent out of fear, were now willing to share their stories, their pain, and their anger. Together they formed an unspoken bond, a fragile alliance forged in the fires of loss and betrayal. The network of parents was vast, spread across several states, each one carrying the same heart-wrenching story. Some had children who were swapped at birth, others had never seen their babies again. As the mother spoke to more parents, she pieced together a terrifying picture. The Hargrove sisters weren't just targeting a few isolated families. They were systematically stealing children and selling them to the highest bidders, all while keeping up the pretense of a legitimate nursery. The depth of the conspiracy was more than she could have ever imagined, and the danger of exposing it seemed overwhelming. But the more she learned, the more determined she became to bring it all to light. However, the deeper the mother delved into the dark web of corruption, the more she realized that the Hargrove sisters' influence stretched far beyond the nursery. There were whispers of high-ranking officials, judges, police officers, and even political figures who were protecting the sisters, helping to cover up their crimes. These powerful figures had been bought off or manipulated, and they were willing to do whatever it took to keep the operation running smoothly. The truth was becoming more elusive, and the stakes were higher than ever. The mother and the families were now in a race against time, not only to find their children, but to expose an empire built on lies and corruption. With this new, terrifying knowledge in hand, the mother and the other parents formed a plan to take down the operation once and for all. They knew the risks were enormous. If the authorities were corrupt, if the sisters had friends in high places, their lives would be in constant danger. But they had no other choice. The evidence they gathered, the records of missing children, and the testimonies of those who had fallen victim to the Hargrove sisters were their only weapons. They began working in the shadows, carefully assembling a strategy to expose the truth without drawing too much attention. Every move had to be calculated, every step executed with precision. The first phase of their plan involved gathering more concrete evidence, finding the connections between the Hargrove sisters and the corrupt officials who had protected them. It was a dangerous game of cat and mouse as they moved in and out of the shadows, carefully avoiding detection. The Hargrove sisters were already on high alert, and the parents knew that their every action was being watched. Tension mounted as they used encrypted messages, met in secret locations, and took every precaution to avoid being caught. It felt like a game of survival, with their lives hanging in the balance. One night, as the mother and her allies were preparing for a crucial meeting, everything went wrong. They were ambushed by a group of men who had been sent to silence them. The chase was frantic, with the group splitting up and scattering in all directions. The mother, heart pounding, sprinted down narrow alleyways, her mind racing as she tried to outrun the men who were closing in on her. The streets felt like a maze, and every corner seemed to bring her face to face with danger. The fear of being caught was overwhelming, but she couldn't afford to stop. Her child was out there, and the truth had to come out. As the night wore on, the mother found herself cornered in a dark alley, her breath ragged as she realized there was no way out. The men who had been following her were closing in, and the sound of their footsteps echoed in the empty streets. Just as she thought all hope was lost, a car pulled up, and one of the parents from the network appeared, offering a way out. They sped through the streets, narrowly avoiding the men who were hunting them, but even as they escaped, the sense of danger was ever present. They were being hunted, not just by the Hargrove sisters, but by the very system that should have protected them. The escape only fueled their resolve. They knew that exposing the Hargrove sisters would be the most dangerous thing they had ever done, but they couldn't back down now. The alliance between the families had become more than just a fight for justice. It was a fight for their survival. The mother's heart was heavy with the knowledge that every move they made brought them closer to the edge. But she also knew one thing for certain: the truth would come out, no matter the cost. The chase was on, and there was no turning back. As the mother dug deeper into the mystery, she uncovered a chilling layer to the Hargrove sisters' operations. What had seemed like an isolated criminal act was, in fact, part of a far-reaching conspiracy that involved powerful figures. It wasn't just about babies being swapped or sold. This was a complex network, a well-oiled machine built on corruption and deceit. The Hargrove sisters were not acting alone. They had connections with politicians, doctors, and even social workers who helped fabricate the entire facade of legitimate adoptions. The more she learned, the more she realized that this was not just about human trafficking. It was a system that benefited the rich and powerful, all at the expense of vulnerable families. The revelation hit the mother like a punch to the gut. The Hargrove sisters had become pawns in a larger game, a game where their actions were orchestrated to serve a corrupt elite. Babies weren't just being stolen and swapped, they were being sold to the highest bidders. Wealthy families who couldn't have children were willing to pay enormous sums to adopt children from these so-called legitimate nurseries, believing they were going through proper channels. The adoption process was nothing more than a cover for a multi-million-dollar child trafficking ring. The Hargrove sisters, in their twisted minds, had convinced themselves they were providing a valuable service. They had become key players in a system that exploited the most vulnerable for financial gain. But the depth of this conspiracy wasn't just shocking, it was dangerous. The mother now knew that taking down the Hargrove sisters would be more complicated than she had anticipated. The network they were a part of wasn't just protected by corrupt officials, it was sustained by them. Politicians and doctors were complicit in the scheme, making sure that the adoption records were falsified and that the stolen children were placed with families who had the means to pay. These figures of authority ensured the operation remained undisturbed, turning a blind eye to the crime and even creating a protective shield around the Hargrove sisters. To expose the operation would mean taking on not just the sisters, but an entire corrupt system. The mother's next steps were clear, but they were fraught with danger. She had to gather concrete, irrefutable evidence to bring down this dark empire. But finding such evidence wasn't easy. The system was designed to be airtight. Fake adoption documents, doctored birth certificates, and hidden financial transactions ensured that everything appeared above board. The people involved in the conspiracy were experts at covering their tracks, and the more the mother searched, the more she realized just how deeply entrenched the corruption went. Each new piece of information she uncovered felt like a step closer to the truth, but it also made her more vulnerable to the dangerous forces working against her. In her desperation, the mother reached out to a trusted ally, a former journalist who had once investigated adoption scandals. This ally had been silenced years ago after threatening to expose similar operations, but they were willing to help now. Together, they began piecing together a trail of evidence. The journalist's experience and knowledge of the inner workings of the adoption system proved invaluable. They dug through mountains of records, tracing the money, tracking fake adoption agencies, and identifying the doctors and politicians involved. Slowly, they began to build a case that could bring the whole operation to light, but they also knew that their every move was being watched. The closer they came to the truth, the more dangerous the situation became. The network of corrupt authorities and the Hargrove sisters' allies weren't about to let their empire crumble without a fight. The mother and her ally had to move carefully, knowing that any misstep could result in their discovery, and worse, their deaths. Tension mounted as they worked tirelessly, their lives on the line with every new lead they followed. It became a game of cat and mouse, with the authorities closing in on them while they scrambled to gather the final pieces of the puzzle. The stakes had never been higher. One wrong move could cost them everything. With the evidence they had gathered, the mother and her ally devised a plan to expose the entire conspiracy. They knew that a simple report to the police wouldn't suffice. The authorities were compromised, and any attempt to go public would likely lead to their deaths before they could make any real impact. They needed to go to the press to make sure that the truth couldn't be silenced by corrupt officials. But even then, the danger wasn't over. The media had its own set of risks, especially when dealing with such a powerful and influential group. The mother felt the weight of responsibility on her shoulders, knowing that the truth was the only thing standing between the children and the continuation of the Hargrove sisters' operation. In the final moments before they were ready to act, the mother reflected on everything she had endured to get to this point. She had risked everything, the safety of her family, her own life, all to bring down an empire built on lies and exploitation. The truth was within her grasp, but the final battle was still ahead. The stakes had never been higher, and the forces that stood in her way were more powerful than she could have imagined. As she prepared to expose the conspiracy, she knew there was no turning back. The truth would either set them free or destroy them, but one thing was certain. The world would know what had happened to the stolen babies, and the Hargrove sisters would no longer be able to hide behind their veil of corruption. As the mother held the last piece of evidence that could bring down the Hargrove sisters and their entire network, her heart raced with both fear and determination. The time had come to expose the truth. Every moment had led to this final showdown, and she knew that the stakes were higher than ever. The evidence was undeniable: a series of falsified adoption papers, financial transactions linking powerful politicians, and testimonies from the parents who had been victimized. With everything in place, she prepared to confront the sisters one last time. But little did she know that the Hargrove sisters were already planning their escape, desperate to destroy everything before it was too late. The moment of truth arrived, when the mother, alongside the other parents, showed up at the Hargrove sisters' estate. The house, once a place of comfort for the babies that were sold and swapped, now felt like a fortress of lies. As they approached the large, imposing gates, the air felt charged with tension. The stakes were clear. This was it. The confrontation would either end the Hargrove sisters' reign of terror or seal the fate of the victims forever. The group had prepared themselves for what was coming, but nothing could fully prepare them for the final battle that would unfold. Inside the house, the sisters were frantic, already trying to pack up their operation and flee with the remaining babies. They had been tipped off about the investigation, and now, desperate to avoid capture, they scrambled to destroy everything they had worked for. Documents were burned, computers were wiped, and babies were hastily taken from their cribs. They knew that the walls were closing in on them, and this was their last chance to escape. But the mother and the parents weren't going to let that happen. They had come too far to be stopped now. As the group entered the house, they were met with a chilling silence. The sisters stood in the grand hallway, their faces cold and calculating, as if they had anticipated this moment. Margaret, the younger sister, was the first to speak, her voice trembling but determined. She tried to deflect the accusations, blaming the parents for their own suffering, claiming that they had agreed to the adoption process willingly. She spoke of their good intentions and how they were only trying to give children the life they deserved. The lies came easily, but the mother saw through them. This time, she wasn't backing down. Eleanor, the older sister, remained silent for a moment, then slowly approached the group. Her expression shifted from anger to something darker, desperation. She knew she couldn't win this fight. The evidence had already been gathered, the truth was too close. But she wasn't ready to give up everything just yet. She attempted to manipulate the situation, trying to turn the tables and make the parents look like the aggressors. She claimed that they had misunderstood, that they were only trying to destroy the nursery out of bitterness. It was a last-ditch effort to salvage whatever power she had left. But the parents were resolute, unwilling to let her spin her lies any longer. The confrontation escalated quickly. The sisters, now cornered, tried to flee, but the group wasn't going to let them escape. The parents had planned for this moment. Every step, every action was meticulously calculated. As Eleanor made a dash for the door, one of the parents blocked her path, holding up a piece of evidence, the final nail in the coffin. The sisters' facade was collapsing in real time. As the truth finally started to sink in, the room grew tense. The sisters' smug expressions turned to panic. They were trapped, and they knew it. The mother stepped forward, her voice trembling with emotion, but filled with authority. She demanded that the sisters stop their escape and face the consequences of their actions. Eleanor hesitated for a moment, a brief flicker of hesitation crossing her face. But then she hardened. She had no choice but to face what was coming. The parents, fueled by years of suffering, moved closer, their presence as a united front overwhelming the sisters. They had finally reached the moment of reckoning, and the Hargrove sisters realized they couldn't manipulate their way out of this one. The truth had finally caught up to them. With the evidence now fully in the open, the tension that had been building for so long reached its peak. The sisters, once untouchable, were now exposed for the criminals they truly were. The house, once a symbol of their twisted operation, felt empty and hollow. The final fight for justice had been fought, and the victory was bittersweet. As the authorities arrived to take the sisters into custody, the mother looked around at the faces of the parents, their journey finally at an end. They had fought for their children, for the truth, and in this moment they had won. The battle had been long and grueling, but it was over, at least for now. The stolen babies would no longer be victims of the Hargrove sisters' reign of terror. The fall of the Hargrove sisters was met with a mixture of relief and disbelief. For the families who had endured years of pain and uncertainty, the revelation that their children were stolen and sold was both a long-awaited justice and a fresh wound. The sisters' arrest was a significant victory, but it didn't erase the years of trauma that the victims had suffered. Families were left to piece together the broken fragments of their lives, the scars from the ordeal running deep. The emotional toll was immense, and many struggled to reconcile the fact that the children they had raised as their own were not biologically theirs. The emotional reconciliation would take years, and for some, it might never come. For the parents, the realization that their children had been swapped at birth left them in a state of constant emotional turmoil. Some felt a deep sense of loss, as if they had missed out on a part of their children's lives that could never be recovered. Others experienced a strange sense of betrayal, not just from the Hargrove sisters, but from the system that was supposed to protect them. The pain of realizing that their children had been stolen in the first place was compounded by the horror of knowing that their legal and emotional rights had been violated on every level. Therapy and support groups were vital for many, but the process of healing was slow and at times overwhelming. The discovery had profound implications beyond the families involved. Society as a whole was shaken by the revelation that such a sophisticated and long-running scheme had gone unnoticed for so many years. The Hargrove sisters had operated under the guise of legitimate adoption services, fooling authorities, doctors, and countless families. It wasn't just a failure on the part of the nursery or the sisters, it was a systemic failure. The inability of society's institutions to properly vet adoption agencies and protect vulnerable children exposed deep flaws in the system. The question on everyone's mind was how many other children had been lost in this way, and how many similar operations were still hidden in the shadows. Despite the justice served to the victims, the flaws in the system remained. The child trafficking network that the Hargrove sisters were a part of was far-reaching, and while their arrest had brought some closure, the infrastructure that allowed such crimes to happen was still in place. The question of accountability loomed large. How many others had profited from such abuses, and how many corrupt individuals were still in power? As the public came to grips with the enormity of the situation, many realized that this scandal was just the tip of the iceberg. The exposure of the Hargrove sisters' operation had opened the door to a larger conversation about child protection, adoption laws, and the need for systemic reform. The emotional and legal battles were far from over. The families whose children had been swapped had to navigate a complex process of reuniting with their biological children, if they were even able to locate them. Some families were fortunate enough to reconnect with their true children, but others found that the children they had raised for years had formed bonds with their new families, making the transition difficult. This wasn't just about legal custody. It was about the emotional and psychological adjustment of both the parents and the children involved. The scars from the trauma were deep, and there was no easy path forward for any of them. The aftershock of the Hargrove sisters' fall also highlighted the vulnerabilities within adoption systems around the world. The trust that families placed in adoption agencies had been shattered, and the public's faith in institutions meant to protect children was severely damaged. New regulations and stricter oversight were promised, but many remained skeptical. The damage had already been done, and the public outcry was a powerful reminder that the systems in place were not foolproof. The real challenge now was to rebuild trust, not only in the adoption process, but also in the systems that were meant to serve and protect the most vulnerable members of society. As the dust settled and the Hargrove sisters faced trial, a powerful message emerged. The system had failed. It had allowed a terrible tragedy to unfold for years without intervention. The emotional and psychological scars of the families affected would never fully heal, and the trauma would ripple through generations. But the story also served as a warning, urging society to take a long, hard look at the flaws in the system and the hidden dangers lurking beneath the surface. The horrors that had been uncovered were a stark reminder of what can happen when institutions fail to protect the most vulnerable. The video ended with a sobering reflection on the dangers of a system that allows such exploitation to thrive unnoticed. The mother, now reunited with her biological child, stood at the forefront of a battle that had cost her everything. The message was clear. While justice had been served, the battle for reform was only just beginning. The horrors of the Hargrove sisters' operation were over, but the underlying issue of child trafficking and institutional corruption remained unresolved. The viewers were left to reflect on how many other stories like this might still be hidden, waiting to be uncovered. The fight for change, for transparency, and for justice was far from over.